Just like that.
Not gonna hang out mine, just yours?
Actually, it's yours.
That's what I thought.
It's dark though. And then I'm gonna go over to Mal.
You going to the mall?
Yesterday we had a long discussion about Tosfos and the innuendos in the Shakravitaria, whether or not we could derive a conclusion that Esei Dochalos Sheish Bokares from the fact that the Torah found it necessary to tell me Hashem Sosai Tishmor the Kibbut Avayim does not override the Shabbos, implying that had it not been a case of Kibbut Avayim overriding the Shabbos, if that wasn't the issue, then we would have applied the principle of Esei Dochalos Aseh. And therefore, the implication of the need for a pasuk sets up that pasuk as telling me the exception to the rule. We're going to learn the opposite from this pasuk, that we would override the Shabbos, if need be, for an essay other than Kibbut Avayim. And that would lead to the Havamina that in the case of Yibum, we would override the Los Aseh V'achos Ishto for the sake of the mitzvah of Yibum. Hence, we need the pasuk Oleha Li'isura. And we had a long discussion about the possibility that Oleha is coming to tell you that there is Yibum, and that despite the fact that as a universal rule, Essay would override a Los Sheish Bokares, but Yibum, despite the fact that as a general rule, Essay would not override a Los Sheish Bokares, nevertheless, in the case of Yibum, it does override a Los Sheish Bokares. And then we had a svara of the Rashba to say that maybe in that sense, Yibum is the exception to the rule. We already have a precedent in the framework of mitzvah Yibum to override the Lo Tzaseh and an Erfa in the case of Eishes Ach, which every case of Yibum by definition is Eishes Ach. So these are some of the various discussions and points that we touched upon yesterday. What I'd like to do now is go through the Shakravitaria here on the bottom of Daf Vav, and then pick it up on Daf Vav of Beis, which is more or less where we got up to. Let's take a look at the Gemara, beginning with Hechsher Mitzvah, which is on Daf Vav Amud Aleph, and that is about 7 lines up from the bottom of the page. Malahanach shekain hechsher mitzvah. Rashi interprets hechsher mitzvah, meaning that there's no way that you can fulfill the essay without violating the los aseh. And therefore, we have a pircha, if you want to derive any conclusions from the cases in which we override a los aseh, maybe that's only because of hechsher mitzvah. But in the case of Yibum, as Rashi points out, it's not a hechsher mitzvah because the possibility exists of fulfilling the obligation through chalitza. And since chalitza is an option, therefore we don't have hechsher mitzvah. And then the Gemara says, Tepukle me hasam. And at that point, the Gemara is invoking the other drasha of Mikdashi Tiro Ani Hashem, that we don't override the Shabbos for the sake of the mitzvah of building the Beis HaMikdash. That too is a case of Hechsher mitzvah. And therefore, we see an exact parallel between the two cases of Hechsher mitzvah, that of Kibbut Av when it conflicts with Shabbos, and that of Binyan Beis HaMikdash when it conflicts with Shabbos. And therefore, we have a kind of an Eno Inyan, that the Torah didn't have to repeat Ani Hashem a second time around to repeat exactly what we knew for the first time around, unless it was coming to tell me that even in a case like Yibum, where there is no Hechsher mitzvah, we still would apply Esei Docha Los Aseh, meaning that the cases of Kibbut Av versus Shabbos and Binyan Beis HaMikdash versus Shabbos, those are the exceptions to the rule where the Torah found it necessary to tell us that we don't override the Shabbos. But the general rule by implication would be that we do override a lav sheyesh kares. That would, in that sense, would justify why we need a leah in the case of achos isha to tell me, don't think that Shabbos, where it says Ani Hashem, is the exception to the rule, but the rule is Esei Dochalos Sheyesh Bo Kares, and therefore I have a havamina that Yibum would override achos ishto, and if you'll apply the pircha, raise the pircha of achos ishto is different because it's not a hechsher mitzvah, then I will invoke the Ani Hashem of Mikdashay Tiro for Binyan Beis HaMikdash as a redundancy, coming to teach me that that is not, whether it is action mitzvah or it's not action mitzvah, in both cases, the essay would override the lo saseh. And therefore, afal pi, even though yibum is not a hekshem mitzvah, it would still override a lav sheish bo kares based on this imeno inyan, the fact that the Torah twice, by implication with Ani Hashem, implied that essay would be docha lo saseh, even though it's yesh bo kares, and we're going to apply that logic to Yibum in the case of achos. That's the way Rashi seems to understand this sugya. Tosfos, on the other hand, on the bottom of this Dibra Maskal, the bottom of the page, the Kain Echsha Mitzvah, quoting the Ri and Rabbeinu Chananel about 5 lines up from the bottom of the page, says that the Gemara right now is going back to the lav of Mechamer. And you'll see the words of Tosfos, the Belav de Mechamer Mukile. And therefore, we have the following question. Wait a second. If we're talking about the lav and the mechamer, and the Torah is telling me that despite the fact that it's a regular lav with a chiv malchus, there's no kares, nevertheless, it does not override Shabbos in the case of kibbud av. So my father asks me to bring in the food that is in, let's call it boxes on top of the beast of burden by causing the animal to move. I do not override the lav of Mechamer on Shabbos for the sake of the essay of Kibbud Av. And therefore, we should derive from this a universal principle. This is what you call a Binyan Av, that ain't essay docha lo saseh. And that would completely undermine the Smichos HaParshis, the drush that we derive from Lo Tilba Shatnez Gedilim Tasel. And now the Gemara is offering an answer to that question as to why, in the case of Kibbud Av versus Mechamer on Shabbos, that's not Docha the Lav, meaning Kibbud Av cannot be Docha the Lav of Mechamer on Shabbos, but for a specific reason that only applies to the scenario of a collision between Kibbud Av and Mechamer, and it would not apply elsewhere where that logic or that principle called Hechsher Mitzvah is inapplicable. Why is Hechsher Mitzvah applicable here in the case of a conflict between Kibbud Av and the Lav of Mechamer? Tosfos explains. This is not going to teach me a universal rule, that essay does not have the power to override a lav greater. Lav greater means without kares. There's a double negative here. You see the lo nelif and lo livche. What it means is that, as a general rule, essay docha lo tzaseh, if it's a regular lo tzaseh. The double negative is that we should not derive the opposite conclusion that ein essay docha lo tzaseh. And why not? It would seem that this is a perfect example of ein essay docha lo tzaseh. That if Kibbud Av cannot override the lav of Mechamer, we should derive a universal rule as a Binyan Av that essay eino docha lo tzaseh. Why? So Tosfos answers because in the collision between Kibbud Av and Mechamer, we have a very specific rule, a very specific description or category, which is called Shekain Hechsher Mitzvah. And Tosfos doesn't go into detail about why and how Hechsher Mitzvah applies in this case. He just says, Kish Mechamer. So that word, Kish Mechamer, if you underline it, that has to contain within it the secret of how the Ri and Rabbeinu Chananel understood the concept of Hechsher Mitzvah, Isha Mechamer. Why is Mechamer a Hechsher Mitzvah? Mechamer means he's transporting the food from place X to location Y. He is not yet feeding his father. And until the moment that he feeds his father, he has not fulfilled the mitzvah of Kibbud Av V'Em. And this is based on a brisa in Masechet Kiddushin, in the Sugya of Kibbud Av V'Em, on Daf Lamed Aleph in Kiddushin. There, the brisa says, Ketzad Mechabdo, how do you mekayim the mitzvah of Kibbud? It says, Motzio, Machniso, Malbisho, or Machilo. All of these are physical services that you do as a son on behalf of your father. Your father benefits physically. You take him by the hand and you lead him one place to the other, or you cover his body when he's cold with a blanket, or you feed him when he's hungry. In all those cases, the Kibbud Av is what we call Hanoas Haguf. In the case of Mechamer, there's no Hanoas Haguf, at least not at this point. He's going to violate the law of Mechamer at time T1. He hasn't yet given any Hanoah to his father, and therefore he hasn't yet fulfilled the mitzvah of Kibbud Av, which he's only going to fulfill later after he violates the law of Mechamer at time T2. And if there's no sync between the essay and the Los Haseh, because what he's doing right now when he violates the Los is only a Hechsher mitzvah, it's only a preparatory preliminary stage in the mitzvah, so he hasn't yet fulfilled the mitzvah until he feeds his father, then there's nothing at this point, there is no mitzvah to be docha the law. It's not that the means justify the ends, or shall I say the other way around, the ends justify the means. It's not that since ultimately the reason he is doing this mechamer is for the purpose and the sake of Kibbud Av Machilo, of giving his father physical pleasure, that's not enough to override the lotas ha-mechamer, since at the time, the moment that he is violating mechamer, he's schlepping the animal, he has not yet come to the point where he's fulfilled the mitzvah saseh. And essay dochalosa requires be'idna, an exact simultaneity between the fulfillment of the essay and the violation of the law. Now Tosfos asks the following two questions, Shtaim Sheinachas. We have another two cases where we will not override the Los Haseh for the sake of the essay of Kibbud Av. Can we apply the principle of Hechsher Mitzvah in those two cases? Or shall we apply the question of V'nigmar Minei? In other words, let's use these cases as a Binyan Av to teach me universally that ain't essay dochalos. What are the two cases? One is Meiniach milahachzer aveda kidei lahavi gozlos. The son is commanded by his father when the son finds himself in a crossroads situation, an either-or situation. He either turn to the right or to the left. He can turn to the right and return a sheep or whatever is a lost roaming animal, lost object. He can turn to the other side, to the left, let's call it, and he can find gozlos, which are hefker, of course, and he can bring them to his father, so his father could eat these pigeons, this meat. His father tells him, forget about the sheep that's roaming around, taniach, leave it behind, and don't be machzir and aveda, because I want you at this crossroads to turn to the left and spend your time bringing me gozlos. That's scenario number one. Then scenario number two is the case of Tumas Mes, where his son is a Kohen, and the father commands his son to enter into a Beis HaKvaros, for whatever reason he wants him to go in there and obtain something, retrieve something. And now the Kohen, the son, will be violating the law of Tumas Kahuna. And in both of these cases, whether it be the case of Laniach Lahachs Milahachs Aveda Ulahavilo Gozlos, For the case of Tumas Kohen, in both these cases, the Gemara invokes the pasuk Eshav Sosai Tishmor Ani Hashem to learn, to derive the conclusion that Kibbud Av will not override the lav of Lo Tuchal Lisalim when he looks aside and he doesn't fulfill his obligation of Hashem Safeda, nor the lav of Tumas Kohen when he enters into the cemetery. And once again, we should ask the question, raise the objection. Let's use these two derivations to universalize the opposite principle that we've been trying so hard to establish, namely Esei Dochalosa. Let's derive from this that ain't Esei Dochalosa, and it's a regular losas. Also says we're going to apply again the principle of Hechsher Mitzvah. Why are these two cases classified as Hechsher Mitzvah? When is he Mekayim? At what point in time is he Mekayim the Mitzvah of Kibbud Av Va'em? That's only when he brings his father Hanas Haguf. Anything before that is just a preliminary stage. He needs to leave the sheep, the lost sheep on the side, ignore it, in order to bring gozlos. But when he brings the gozlos, he has not yet involved himself in the mitzvah of Kibbud Av Va'em. Why? Because it's a hechsher mitzvah. He has to bring the gozlos and then feed his father the gozlos. And now Tosfos is going to say that in the case of Tumas Kohen, to be metame himself by going into the cemetery, the Kohen is not yet fulfilling the mitzvah of Kibbud Av. Now again, if we assume, which is a big, big if, that his father is telling him to go into the cemetery in order to retrieve gozlos, maybe there are birds, kosher birds that are flying in the cemetery, and he can capture them and bring them to his father, then I understand very well that that case of Tumas Kohanim falls under the category, the description of Hechsher Mitzvah. Why? Because he's not being Mekayim Kibbud Av Va'em until he brings the gozlos. So right now he's entering into the cemetery as a preliminary stage. Alternatively, maybe his father wants him to bring something else from the cemetery. I don't know. Maybe his father wants him to visit his grandfather's gravesite. I don't know. And he'll only fulfill the mitzvah of Kibbud Av later on when he visits his grandfather's gravesite. But in the meantime, he's entering into the cemetery. The moment he passes through the gates of the cemetery, he becomes Tomei. Or when he passes a kever, it becomes Tomei. And that's called Hechsher Mitzvah. So again, reading the language of Tosfos, he says, Ishemechamer umetame umeniach milahachzer aveda. Now, I think these words meniach milahachzer aveda going back on mechamer. No, my mistake. Kim shemechamer kama, or mitame kama, or meniach milahachzer aveda kama. In all those three cases, is malaki which attain hechsher mitzvah. So when he's involved in being mechamer or being mitame or ignoring someone else's lost object, in all these cases, it's a hechsher mitzvah. Now at the end he writes kidei lahavi gozlos. I don't know if that's going back on milachas aveda. Maybe it's going back on mitame. It's a little bit unclear in my mind. And now we have to underline the next few words. This is the key of keys to unlock the mystery of Tosfos. He says, B'shas techias halav, when he violates the lav of lo simcha l'salim, or being mitami lemes, or violating the lav mechamer, ein machilo umalbisha. He's not feeding him or clothing him. And this is going to answer the question of Vinigmar. Why don't we derive from these cases that ein essay dochalosa? The alma, the ovid gufa mitzvah, yalfidami kalayim mitzitzis, the dochit. We'll go back to our original drasha of smichas aparshas of tzitzis and kalayim, and we'll establish the principle of essay dochalosa, but only if he's the ovid begufa the mitzvah. At the moment of the violation of the law, for example, when he's wearing the kilayim, he is being makayim the mitzvah of tzitzis. We once, if you recall, had a question of the Shagasariya that the mitzvah of tzitzis is a little bit later. It's only after he's already lavush. It's not at the moment that he puts on the beged, but after the beged on his body is equipped with daled confidence. Fine, we had a discussion about that. But be that as it may, the bottom line is that kilayim b'tzitzis is be'idna, it is gufa shel mitzvah, and simultaneous with the kiyum of the mitzvah of tzitzis comes the violation of the law of kilayim, essay dochalosas. But don't derive the opposite conclusion from the cases that we've discussed, because in all those cases, it's mali kiburav shekain hechshet mitzvah. He's not right now, when he violates the law, preoccupied with machilo or malbisho. We called hanoah saguf. Now, before we get to the low plug that we discussed yesterday at the end of this Tosfos, I have a problem. And if I can invoke or evoke, I should say, evoke your empathy, I'd be very happy. And the Gemara says that if you have a daiga, yasiach lechavero. I'll tell you what I don't understand. We started this sugya with a brisa. The brisa quoted here on Daf Heyom and Beis. 7 lines up before the end. 2, 4, 6. Shabbos, Talmud Lomar, Ish Aviv, Ish Imo Aviv Tiro, Esham Sose Tishmoru Kuchem Chayovim B'chvodi. Now, what's the case? So the Gemara says, "My love, the Amalei Shchotli Bashel." The time of the Kosev Rachmana Eshab Sosai Tishmo Holav Ochi Doch. And this is the source, the proposed source, for deriving the conclusion that Esei Dochalosa Sheish Bo Kares. I don't get it. We have a principle that essay dochlos is only be'idna, only if there's an absolute synchronization. Is there such a word, synchronization? If not, we'll affect it. Between the essay and the losas. So now he's cooking for his father. What hanos haguf is his father getting from his cooking? Right now, it's a hechshem mitzvah. Tos says it explicitly. He's not being machil his father, he's preparing the food. Same is true for shchotli. And if it's embedded, and this is the way we understand essay dochalosa, that right now, although I'm violating a losas, I'm fulfilling an essay, and the essay therefore trumps the losas, and that doesn't apply in this case. And the Gemara is saying that time of the Kosev Rachmana, that the universal rule would have been essay dochalosa, we would have applied it here as well, if not for the pasuk Anoch Ani Hashem. When we don't have the pasuk, then essay dochalosis. If I don't get it, the Gemara says explicitly it's a case of basheli or shchotli. The Gemara rejects this proof by saying we're not dealing with the lav shem bokars, we're dealing with the lav of mechamed. Lo, the Gemara says, and here we turn to the vav and aleph, lav de mechamed. Lav de mechamed is a classic case of hechsher mitzvah. What hanas haguf does his father enjoy from mechamer, from the fact that he leads the beast of burden? Now again, if you're going to say, Tosa at one point says lavdaf, maybe there really was never a hamamina that essay dochalosas on. But that's not the simple reading of Gemara. That's certainly not the way Rashi read it. This is a case of ein esei dochalosas. In fact, when the Gemara adds lav to machaber, the Gemara is going to say, El de kaimel on the top of Vav and Aleph, the Yossi esei v'dochilosas, el ligmar me'och, the lo dochi. So obviously the Gemara is applying the rule of esei dochalosas. And the Torah now tells us that you made a mistake, and an essay cannot override a losa, and we're talking about a regular losa set of machamer, then you see that essay dochalosa. I mean, the Gemara doesn't seem to reject essay dochalosas. And according to Tosfos, when we get down 7 lines up before the end of the Amud, if you fast forward, and it says mitzvah, at that point, according to Tosfos, the Gemara is completely rejecting essay dochalosas and its application to these cases of kibbut avayim because we're dealing with a hechsher mitzvah. Machamer is a hechsher mitzvah. Even shchotli and basheli is a hechsher mitzvah. He has not yet fulfilled the essay of machilo malbisha. But this is very strange. That an entire sugya with the whole Shakavitarya from the top of Daf Vav and Aleph to the bottom of Daf Vav and Aleph is predicated on the assumption that doesn't make any sense. Namely, that essay dochalosa should apply in the cases of kibbut avayim. And the Gemara quotes a brisa here on Daf Vav that Yachol Amalo Aviv Hitame Osha Amalo Al Tachzir, don't return an Aveda, Yachol Yishmala, Tamalom Eshab Sosi Tishmoru. Then the Gemara quotes another brisa, Yachol Yepinyan Pesach Mikdash Docha Shabbos, Tamalom Eshab Sosi Tishmoru. Okay, that's not relevant to my question because that's not a hechsher. That's gufam. Okay, fine. But what about the cases of machamer, or for that matter, bashali, shchodli, or the cases of hitame, or al tachsilo aveda? All these cases, there's no anos aguf, there's no machigo mashkeru, and the Gemara wants to apply the principle of esei dochalos, if not for the drasha of kulchem chayom bechvod. But where's esei dochalos? So if you empathize with my problem, if you don't, then what I'm about to say is totally unnecessary. I think the conclusion to be derived here is that the Gemara had a havamina that everything depends on what your father said to you. The words of your father, the command, everything is totally in the tzivur. If your father said to you, quote, hitame, or he said to you, al tachzir, or he said to you to be machamer, then what you call a hechsher mitzvah is not a hechsher mitzvah at all. That becomes a mitzvah kibbut. And this reminds me of the famous Marik. Marik wants to know whether or not you have to listen to your parents when they tell you, don't marry so-and-so. That touches on a very sensitive issue in terms of finding a marriage partner, because sometimes your parents are not happy with your choice. So the question is, do I have to listen to my parents? My father gave me a command. He said, I want you to leave this animal that has food on its back in order to feed me. I want you to look on the side and don't pay any attention to this roaming sheep. And I have something else in mind for you, that you'll be able to feed me gozels. Or for whatever reason, his father tells me, I want you to enter into the cemetery, and he's a Kohen. Once his father formulates that command, then it comes under kibbut avayim. Tosfos is saying that when the Gemara finally rejects this with the svara of kain hechsher mitzvah, the Gemara is now shifting kibbut avayim from the command to the Anos HaGuf. And the command and the fulfillment of that command now becomes a Hechsher mitzvah. But the Gufa mitzvah is the Hana. I don't think the Gemara was aware of that, or maybe it was aware of that svara, but rejected that svara and held that the fulfillment of my father's command, that in itself is the mitzvah of kibbud avon. So could you imagine if my interpretation is correct of the Havamina in the Gemara, what the repercussions would be in terms of the scope of kibbud avon? I applied to 2 colleges, 2 universities. I got accepted to one, and then I got accepted to the other. They're really after me, right? I had 1,300 points. I want to go to A, and my father says, I want you to go to B. Is that kibbud avon A? Does my father have the right to command me to do whatever he wants? And imagine he's commanding me to be machamer on Shabbos. That's not a nice thing to do. He's commanding me as a Kohen to be mitame lemes. He's commanding me to pay no attention to the Chetzela that's roaming around and requires Hashem. But he commands me. And if he commands me, the Havamid, at least, that's called kibbud avon. So it means that while I'm being machamer, at that moment, I am involved in the mitzvah of kibbud avon. That becomes gufa shel mitzvah because I'm fulfilling his tzivur. And his tzivur is what generates the mitzvah of kibbud avon. And the moment I'm being mitame, the moment I am ignoring the aveda, that is a fulfillment of his command, hence a mitzvah of kibbud avon. Not a hechsher mitzvah, but gufa shel mitzvah. It tells his name. You're misinterpreting and you're not defining the mitzvah kibbud avon correctly. Kibbud avon means hanos haguf. I was thinking the following: in the light of Tosas' Shita Lamaskana, that the Gemara ends off with a much more narrow definition of the application of kibbud avon. It's got to be hanos haguf. What happens in the following scenario? My father's thirsty. I bring him a cup of tea. He didn't ask me for the cup of tea. There was no tzivui, there was no command. But there's hanos haguf. So in theory, I don't know if the technology is up to this point yet, but if I could put something on his head and read his electrodes and know exactly what he wants and what would be as hanos haguf, then I'd be mechuyev b'toras kibbud avon machilo malbisha. I don't have to wait till my father says, turn down the air conditioning. I'm cold. Or bring me a blanket, a quilt because I'm cold. I don't have to wait for that. The tzivui, the command, is not part of the mitzvah. The mitzvah is to be mahana his guf. Now again, if he's not thirsty and I bring him tea, then he gets no hana from that. But if I can anticipate, I can intuit that he wants a cup of water, then by bringing him the water without a command, I fulfill the mitzvah of kibbud avon. I don't need the command. And in the language or terminology of the Shas, I would call the command, according to Tosfos, a gilui milsa di'alma. It's only a way of knowing what my father wants and what hanos haguf I can give him. I can only know that because I can't read his mind if he tells me. But when he tells me, telling me itself does not generate a mitzvah kibbud avon. It's the hanos haguf that generates. By telling me and revealing me that this is the hanos haguf that he needs. Now when I'm mahana him, I give him ochel or malbush. I'm a kind of the mitzvah because now I know he's already revealed to me that this is what he wants and this is what will bring him comfort. But if the tzibur is just that, it's only a command. There's no hanos haguf at all. He tells me, I want you to go to Columbia rather than NYU. There's no hanos haguf. My father's not going to benefit physically if I go to this college or that college. My father tells me to marry this girl and not that girl. There's no hanos haguf. See where there is. In the Havamina, maybe the Gemara was of the opinion that Sivui does generate a mitzvah of Kibbut Avei, fulfill his command. The Gemara's Maskana is no. Let's read the Brisa. The Brisa gives cases in which you Makayim Kibbut Avei, and what's common to all those cases is Hanas Haguf. Machilo, Malbisho, Machniso, Mozo, all this is Hanas Haguf. What gives you the right to expand Kibbut Avei to include any tzivui, a kiyumat tzivui, minus hanos, in the absence of hanos haguf, which would incredibly broaden the scope of kibbut avayim. Now I have to ask the following question. As we say in Yiddish, if this is correct, everything that we've been saying. So what presses the Gemara to drop its original premise? Namely that tzivui is a mitzvah. It's a pretty good argument. I mean, my father tells me to do X. I'm certainly giving him respect by fulfilling his wishes. Meaning, what compels the Gemara, the way Tosa says it, to severely limit and restrict the application of kibbut avei to hanos haguf? The Torah says, respect your parents. Is it not respectful when I fulfill that command? I mean, God commands 613 times. Any hanos haguf, I fulfill the will of God, implement His command, and that is kibbut of Hashem. That's kvod Hashem. Also, it says kvod Hashem yihoncha. You have to spend money on a mitzvah. That's kvod Hashem. Why shouldn't the same thing apply in a mirror image in the case of kibbut avayim? So that my argument claims that the Havamin is better than the Maskana. And then, to top it off, there are poskim who say that I have to listen to my father. He absolutely opposes my marrying this girl. I have to oblige him. That's not the Marik's conclusion. There are poskim who say such a thing. In the case of Yitzchak Avinu, it was almost like he didn't have a choice. Avraham Avinu said to Eliezer, brings back Rivka, and that's it. Marriage made in heaven. It's a famous story about the Hasidic Rebbe that the shadchan was hired by the Rebbe, and then he found a nice girl. So the Rebbe checked out the girl and her yichus and everything else. The shidduch. So they said Mazel Tov. So the son said, "What do you mean Mazel Tov? I didn't even meet the girl." So the father says to him, "If you don't behave properly, if you don't be silent, you won't even show up for the chuppah. We won't let you come." I would like to suggest that even the Maskana, there are two dimensions to the mitzvah of kibbut avayim. There are two machayvim and two kiyum. One is tzivui, and the other is hanos haguf, even without tzivui. Tzivui means that the very command generates the mitzvah of kibbut avayim. I can't figure out what he wants. Even if I have a machine, technology, I can read his mind. That's garbage. That's not worth a dime. That's called tzivui. It's the tzivui that generates the mitzvah. And then there's another halacha called hanos haguf. And anos haguf generates a kiyum of kibud avayim, and a chiyuv of kibud avayim, even in the absence of a tzibur. I don't need the command. If I have a sixth sense or a ruach hakodesh, and I know this is what my father needs physically, and I service him, that's a mitzvah of kibud avayim. The case. So what does Tosfos mean when he says that Machamin and the like, Mitame and Alchase Vedel, is only a hechsher mitzvah? So I want to ask the following question. Then we'll get back to this. When I have a conflict in Kibbud Av Va'em, and the Torah says A and not B, and instead of choosing A, I chose B, do I have a mitzvah of Kibbud Av Va'em? I messed up. I wasn't supposed to do it. According to the guidelines of the Torah, I wasn't supposed to go down that route, but I went down that route anyway. Do I have a mitzvah of kibbud av va'em? Here's my case. My father asks me for a cup of water. My mother asks me for a cup of water. Now, there are two machayvim here. There's the machayv of kibbud av and there's the machayv of kibbud ein. So the Gemara Masechet Kiddushin in the Sugya Kibbud Av on Lamed Aleph asks, what should he do in that case? So the Gemara says, Anach kvodi mecha, the kabedes avicha, became ata the mecha chayav b'chvod avicha. That in the framework of marriage, a woman is obligated in the covenant of her husband. You and your mother both share that covenant, that common covenant vis-a-vis your father. Therefore, the mitzvah of kibbud av will win out. It will trump the mitzvah of kibbud ein. Okay, this guy's an Ibra Chacham. Maybe he likes his mother more than his father, I don't know. And instead of giving his father a cup of tea, he gives his mother a cup of tea. Or a glass of water, right? So what are you going to say in that case? Yesh lachka. Are we going to say that since he violated the law of the Torah says kibbud av now trumps kibbud ein, he forfeits the mitzvah. Not just the mitzvah of kibbud av, but he forfeits the mitzvah of kibbud ein. There is no mitzvah of kibbud ein. Or shall we say, no. The Torah says that you give priority to kibbud av, but the mitzvah of kibbud ein is not gone. It doesn't dissipate into thin air. You're still chayiv in the mitzvah of kibbud ein. When you get around to it. Right now, you don't have any free time. You are busy, preoccupied with kibbud av, because kibbud av comes first. But the very first moment that you become, as we say in Hebrew, panui, you're free, at that moment you bring your mother a cup of water. You didn't do it that way. So you violated the law of priority, which is called kedima. So you undermined kedima of giving your father first. That doesn't mean that you forfeited the mitzvah of kibbud ein. You fulfilled the mitzvah of kibbud ein. And therefore, you'll get brownie points, you'll get credit, and schar for kibbud ein. I'll have to give you a couple of lashes because you undermine the mitzvah of kedima of kibbud av. Now let's talk about our student. My father tells me on Shabbos to be machamed. And we derive from Eshabsosei Tishmoru, etc., that I am going to observe the Shabbos faithfully, loyally, and I will not be machamer acher behem. I will not cook for him. I will not shecht an animal for him. So this guy's an Ibra Chacham. And he says, well, kibbut avim is such a great mitzvah. It's up there in the Decalogue. I am going to be machabed my father. What would you say? Does he have a kiyum, a mitzvah of kibbut av? Is it like the case where he gave his mother a cup of water rather than his father? Are we dealing with Eshel Sosai Tishmoru, this clash between kibbut av and Shabbos, as a kedima halacha? Shabbos comes first. Second, kibbut av. You switched around the order. You were machabed your father. You gave up and you forfeited kvod Shabbos. Fine, we'll give you brownie points and schar mitzvah for kibbut av, and we'll give you a patch for violating the Shabbos. Any? What would you say, Jeff? I'm just intuitive.
The mitzvah of kibbut av equivalent, but in a matter of kedima, that's a hope of something. So I would say that he still has his mitzvah kibbut.
What about here? My father tells me to be machamer on Shabbos, or to cook for me, slaughter for me on Shabbos. Torah says Shabbos comes first. Is it just like the case where your father comes before your mother?
I wouldn't think so. You're talking the difference between HaKadosh Baruch Hu and Av. Then there are equivalents, but ultimately it's there.
So I would say the following. I agree with you 100%, 1,000%. I just want to reformulate what you're saying in conceptual terms. Ani Hashem, Eshav Sosei Tishmoru. Ani Hashem means, I'm going to say it sort of metaphorically, that the will of God, as far as Shabbos is concerned, is a capital W. The will of your father is a small w, a very significant will, but it doesn't kowtow. It cringes in the collision with the will of God. The Torah is not giving you an option of kibbut av. And here's the lumps. The Torah is telling you that when there's a clash between kibbut av and Shmiras HaShabbos, there is no kibbut av. That's not what the Torah is telling me in kibbut aim when kibbut av gets priority. The Torah is not saying there's no kibbut aim. You're chayav in kibbut aim. Just you don't have the time right now to fulfill that for you. Your priority puts kibbut av first. But the kibbut aim, there's nothing that is, how shall I say, invalid. There's no psul in the kibbut aim here. She's asking for a cup of water, she's thirsty. And I'll prove it to you if they're divorced, then the father doesn't come first. Then it's flip a coin, or wherever's closer. She's standing here, he's standing there, father's closer, mother's further. There's nothing possible in the kibbut aim. He has a full-fledged kiyum of kibbut aim. He messed up on kibbut av by forfeiting kibbut av, or at least kedima of kibbut av. And, we'll have to deal with him for that. But to say, therefore, that we undermine and invalidate his kibbut aim, that's ridiculous. There's no reason to say so. It's a matter of kedima. You should have waited for the cup for your mother and wait till you finish with the cup for your father. But here in our sugya, where there's a collision with Shabbos, and the Torah says, Eshav Sosai Tishmoru, Ani Hashem Kulchem Chayom B'chvodi, what the Torah is telling us is that the mitzvah here doesn't get off the ground. There is no kibbut av over here. You decided, you know what? I'm going to make a different call over here. I'm going to forget about the guidelines of the Torah. I have my own guidelines. I want kibbut av aim to override the Shabbos. You don't have the right to do so. Oh, here's where the svara of Hechsher Mitzvah comes to the. We said that there were two parts to the mitzvah of kibbut av. One is tzivui, L'kayim es ha-command, es hatzivui, and the other is hanos haguf, when he has physical pleasure. In our case, the mitzvah of kibbud av is out. It doesn't even register. It doesn't get off the ground. And if he does machamer, he'll get lashes for violating Shabbos, and he'll get absolutely no, what we call it, points up in heaven for a kiyum mitzvah. No schar whatsoever, no brownie points. Why? Because there's a hechsher mitzvah. There's no hanos haguf. It's purely tzibur. It's kiyum tzibur. The Torah tells me, Ani Hashem, my tzibur overrides his tzibur. And if there's no hanas haguf, it's only a hechsher mitzvah, then the mitzvah begins and ends, it basically exhausts itself with kiyum tzibur. And if the tzibur does not register on the halachic Richter scale, then there's no mitzvah whatsoever. What's he going to say? Well, my father told me to be machanim, and I fulfilled his will, his command. No. That tzivui of your father, insofar as it contradicts the tzivui of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, does not register, it doesn't generate a chiyuv of kibbud av v'em. But Lu Yitzuyur, if I had a physical pleasure of my father, and at the moment that I'm giving my father physical pleasure, I would violate a lav, then I would apply the principle of esei dochalosis. Again, I have to see, maybe it's a losa sheish bokares, a regular losa. Again, we have to go through all the rules and regulations about esei dochalosis. But in that case, it's not the tzivui that generates the mitzvah. Haraya, if I could read his mind, and I know that he needs a blanket or he needs a cup of water, I would certainly be Mekayim the mitzvah, keep it up for him. I don't have to wait till his tzivui. His tzivui is only a technicality, it's only a gili milsa. If I can circumvent the need for that technicality, for that gili milsa, and I know this is hanos haguf, I would obtain a full-fledged mitzvah without lacking even a nuance of the mitzvah of kibbud av v'em. And if the mitzvah of kibbud av v'em emerges, the moment that he needs, my father needs a physical service, and if at that moment when I'm doing the physical service, I violate a lav, then that comes under esei dochalosas. And that's called guf ha-mitzvah. What does it mean when Tosas says guf ha-mitzvah? Because Tosas says that in the case of guf ha-mitzvah, if let's say I would give my father physical service and at that point I would violate a lav, then Tosas says we would apply the principle of esei dochalosas. Again, he has a low plug, but you have to figure out what that's all about. But in theory, in principle, esei dochalosas. Why? What's the difference between physical pleasure and tzivur? Unless Tosas completely rejects, maybe the Marik would agree with that, there's no such thing as tzivur. And that's not at all in the purview of kibbud av v'em. But if we assume that there is a mitzvah of kibbud av v'em with kiyum tzivur, even in the absence of hanos haguf, so what's the difference between hanos haguf, which Tosas says is guf ha-mitzvah, and we would apply esei dochalosas for the sake of kibbud av v'em, trumping a losa, as opposed to a tzivui, which he calls hechsher mitzvah. Why is that inferior? The answer is inferior because that mitzvah of tzivui can only emerge and can only be generated by a tzivui. And if that tzivui contradicts the tzivui of the Torah, then that tzivui does not register at all. The mitzvah of kibbud av v'em doesn't even get off the ground. It doesn't start. Is the Mela. Even the Maskana, we could say that there is a mitzvah of kibbud av v'em in the case of tzivui, but first it has to pass a test. And that test is, does that tzivui, is it mundane, is it parva, or is it treif? What makes the tzivui treif? Because it comes directly in conflict with the tzivui of the Torah. If it passes the test, and that tzivui is parva, my father says to me, go to this college and not that college, then Elchinami, I have a mitzvah of kiyum tzivui, of kibbud av against the Marik. And Tosas never meant to say, and go as far as the Marik, that the entire mitzvah of kibbud av v'em can be reduced and is exhausted with physical service. No. Even if there's no Anos Haguf, I still am machabed my father by listening to and obliging his will, but only if that will emerge and generate a mitzvah of kibbut avin, and that depends upon whether it contradicts the tzibur of the Torah. If it doesn't contradict the tzibur of the Torah, then achinami I have a mitzvah, and I fulfill his tzibur. If I want to claim, well, you know what, NYU is a very good dental school, but I can't get 3 minyanim a day. In Colombia, I get 3 minyanim a day. I actually had this child, not myself. I never planned to go to dental school, nor could I have gotten into dental school. But I actually had a Talmud, learned him about Masechet, and he got accepted to both Columbia and NYU. And he calls me up from America. I'm telling you a true story. It sounds like I fabricated for the purpose of the shir, but I didn't. And he calls me up and he says, Rabbi Berzon, what should I do? I got accepted to 2 very, very excellent dental schools. Which one should I go to? So I said to him, what are the chances in each case of getting accepted to a postgraduate program? You know, you want to become, what's it called? A gum specialist. What's it called? Anyway, you want to go into a specialty program. So he told me that Columbia has a better record. He did the research. So I said, so why are you thinking of NYU? So he tells me because in NYU, he gets 3 minyanim a day. Imagine, the man is deciding his future based on where during medical school, during dental school, he can get 3 minyanim a day. So his father says to him, this is not part of the story. This already is created for our purpose. His father says to him, I want you to go to Columbia. And he says, no, I want to go to NYU, Dad. So in that case, you have a kibbut avim of tzivui, but he claims, I spoke to Rabbi Berzon, and he told me that I should go to NYU. Well, I guarantee 3 minyanim a day. Now I have a conflict between your tzivui and the tzivui of the Ribono Shel Olam to get 3 minyanim a day. So the tzivui doesn't register. But in Hanos Haguf, then I apply the principle of Esei Dochalosis. If I have no way of physically serving my father without violating simultaneously at the moment of the Machilo Malbisho, a violation of a law, then I have a head-on collision between an essay and a losis. The essay is not an essay that emerges because of his tzivui, such that now his tzivui, my father's tzivui, conflicts with the tzivui of the Torah and therefore doesn't register. No, it's Hanos Haguf without tzivui. The tzivui is just a technicality. It's just helping me read his mind. And therefore it is nothing more than a Hechatimsa or a Gili Milsa. And therefore the mitzvah is Hanos Haguf. If the mitzvah is Hanos Haguf, I will apply the principle of Esei Dochalosa. If that be the case, then I can have my cake and eat it. What do I mean? I could say that the Gemara, from the beginning to the end, until the end, understood that Kiyum Tzivui is a mitzvah of kibbut avim. And the Gemara never dropped that principle. Tosa says that here we're not going to apply the principle of Esei Dochalosa, except for the reason of Hechsher mitzvah, because right now, when he is doing the machamer, he's not being machil or mashke his father. There's no anos haguf, and it's not be'id. Tosis doesn't mean to say that at the moment of being machamer, it's meaningless because there is no such thing as tzivu in the context and in the framework of kibbut av. No, there is a mitzvah of kibbut in tzivu, but it's not identical with the mitzvah of hanos haguf. Hanos haguf is a mitzvah per se that emerges without a tzivu. Tzivui is a mitzvah of kibbut that emerges when I get the tzivui. And it's not that I can figure out what he wants. You know, oh, I see my father's a big fan of Columbia. No. It's if your father commands you, that tzivui, that verbal command, generates a mitzvah of kibbut av. But here the Torah says, Eshav Sosei Tishma, Ani Hashem. That tzivui can only register on the Richter scale of kibbut avim and generate kibbut avim, if that tzivui is what I call parva. It doesn't in any way undermine and conflict with the Torah tzivui. But if it conflicts with the Torah tzivui, then Ani Hashem, the big W, I'm the boss. His will doesn't even register. And therefore, I go back to my assumption that if this man would make a decision that I want kibbut av and I'm going to be mekayim his tzivui, and I'm going to violate the Shabbos by being mechamer, he gets no credit whatsoever. He's purely to be criminally condemned as a machal Shabbos. Not so in the case of the father and the mother. There, although there's a kedima, but the mitzvah of keep it out for Amy emerges by virtue of the hanas haguf. I gave my mother a cup of tea. She needed that cup, and therefore she gets hanas haguf. That itself is a meaningful mitzvah. Again, he will fault him for ignoring the restriction or the rule and regulation of kedima, but certainly obtains the mitzvah of kibbutz. And there are both sides. That's where we're going to start stuff. Think about it. If what I'm saying is right, then it has a lot of meaning, and it could have tremendous repercussions in terms of kibbutz.
It's a challenge, knowing what